This video is going to illustrate to you the blood flow through different parts of the heart during a normal circulation. The first thing you need to identify are the 4 heart chambers. So here they are. Again, like what we discussed in the lesson, the heart has divided into upper chamber and lower chamber. The upper chamber, known as atrium, it's receiving blood from the outside, while the ventricles, the lower chambers, they are responsible for pumping the blood out of the heart to another part in the body. The human has a double circulation in which the heart has a special connection with the lungs. So the right side of the heart, it's responsible for handling the deoxygenated blood that is collected from the system, from different body organs, and then send it out to the lungs. The lung carry out gaseous exchange so that the oxygen diffuse in the air sac diffuse into the blood, and these blood become oxygenated and would come back to the left side of the heart, which is responsible for collecting the blood from the lungs and also pump it out to the other body parts there. So that's why we have a right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle. So let's trace how the blood flows, starting from collecting the blood from different body parts. This is the job. The blood will flow from different veins, and they are finally collected to the biggest vein in your body, known as vena cava. So I'll put the letter 1 here to represent the sequence of blood flow. Now in your textbook, it is further separated into anterior and posterior vena cava, or superior and inferior vena cava, but we don't need that. So as long as you know it's vena cava, that's all right. So it's the biggest vein collecting blood from all the veins in your body, and the blood flows back into the heart. The blood will then flow into right atrium. This heart chamber collects the blood. So please also add these arrows to showcase the blood flow. I use blue color because it represents deoxygenated blood. Then the blood in the right atrium will be pumped into right ventricle. The ventricle would then contract and pump the blood out of the heart through the vein here, called pulmonary vein, pumping the blood towards the lungs. The word pulmonary is always related to lungs. So then the blood will flow into the lung, that is not shown in this picture. Oxygen diffuse into the blood so that the blood becomes oxygenated, and they return to the heart through veins, and that is called pulmonary vein. The blood is then collected into the left atrium. So that's 0.6, 0.7. The left atrium would then pump the blood into the left ventricle. This ventricle is very special. It has a very thick muscular wall so that it can generate a very high blood pressure to pump the blood for a very long distance. This is necessary because the ventricle would then pump these oxygenated blood out of the heart to different body parts, up to the brain, down to the leg. This biggest artery we have here is called aorta. So when you study, please don't just study the words. You have to link them up in sequence so that you remember how the blood flows from one place to another. So let's try this again. Blood is collected from the body, different body parts, into vena cava. The blood then enters right atrium. Right atrium contracts so that it pumps the blood down to the right ventricle. Right ventricle then contracts to pump the blood through pulmonary artery to lungs. Then the blood in the lungs will return to the heart through pulmonary vein. The blood will be collected in left atrium. The left atrium contracts and pumps the blood to left ventricle. Then the left ventricle contracts and pumps the blood through aorta to all different body parts except the lungs. So read this several times at home so that you can remember all the sequence. One thing to notice is that even though this is a vein, but it carries oxygenated blood from the lungs. So veins and artery, they are not defined by the type of blood they carry. They are defined by the direction of blood flow. These are veins, even though they carry oxygenated blood, even though I use red arrows, because the blood is flowing back towards the heart. Similarly, these vessels, even though they are carrying the oxygenated blood, even though I use blue color, it is an artery because it is directing the blood away from the heart. Now, there are some blanks that are remaining. It means that these structures, they are not going to involve, they're not heart chambers, they're not blood vessels, but they are involved in directing the blood flow. These structures ensure the blood flow in the right direction. The first structure we discussed in the class is septum, which is a very important structure in preventing the mixing of the deoxygenated blood on the right side with the oxygenated blood in the left side, so that the blood in the left side of the heart can remain having a very high oxygen concentration without being diluted by the deoxygenated blood. Now, there are then structures in the heart that directs the blood flow. It is necessary because if you take a look at this ventricle, now imagine when the ventricle contracts. Now, same for both sides, so I choose one side to illustrate. Imagine this ventricle contracts. It creates a very high pressure, so it pumps the blood out of the ventricle. But if you take a look carefully, there are two possible openings there. Of course, you want the blood to go through this. Now, don't think this line will block anything. This is a very thin line in the 3D space there, so it will not block blood flow. Okay, don't mix up. It's a very thin line structure in the heart within the space there. There's a 3D space. So the blood can either flow through this direction, which is good because this should be the correct direction of blood flow. But don't forget there is an opening here between the ventricle and the atrium. So when there is a great pressure here in ventricle, the blood will flow anywhere when there is an opening. So the blood will flow to both openings theoretically. But you only want this. You only want the blood to flow in this direction. You don't want the blood to flow through this opening. So that needs a valve, because whenever there is a valve, it can ensure the blood to flow in only one direction. And from what we taught today in the lesson, by looking at the shape of the valve, you would understand that when the blood tries to flow up, the blood pressure itself would somehow close the valve here, preventing the backflow of the blood from ventricle into atrium. Again, this story would be the same on the left side, so I don't repeat it. So this type of valve exists on both sides of the heart. Alright, when ventricle contracts, it will close these valves, so it forces the blood to go through the correct channel. And you can see the valves here at the base of these blood vessels, arteries, they open when the blood flows in the right direction. These valves are called cuspid valves. In your heart, the cuspid valve is made up of a number of flaps. On the right side of the heart, it's made up of 3 flaps. So that's why it's called tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve. While on the left side of the heart, those valves are made up of only 2 flaps there. So it's called bicuspid valve. Bicuspid valve. 我嘅記法係左二右三，左二右三，咁你就會記得邊個係 bicuspid， 邊個係 tricuspid valve。The function of these cuspid valve is to prevent the backflow of blood from ventricle back into atrium when the ventricle contracts. But there is another kind of backflow that is possible. It happens when the ventricle relaxes. Now imagine the ventricle relax. Now the pressure inside the ventricle would be very low. The blood that is in the pulmonary artery does not have sufficient pressure to progress, so they would naturally try to fall back due to gravity, due to pressure difference. But this is not good, because you want the blood to flow only in one direction out of the heart in the arteries. So that's why there is a valve here. And by the shape, you can see that when there is a backflow like this, the pressure would naturally close the valve. Again, this backflow would happen when the ventricle relaxes and the pressure in the ventricle becomes low. Blood in atrium will fall into ventricle, and that's good, but we don't want the blood in the pulmonary artery to fall back into ventricle. Same for the right side there. Same for the left side there. We don't want the blood in the aorta to flow back into ventricle when ventricle relax. We only want the atrium blood to flow into ventricle. So these valves would close as well. These are much smaller valves at the base of these arteries compared with the cuspid valves. They are called the semi-lunar valves. Semi-lunar valve 半月反 Lunar 係月亮 ，semi 係半，所以叫半月反。因為佢哋每塊反都好似半個月亮咁嘅形狀。So when you study these valves, you have to remember which direction of backflow it is trying to stop, and more importantly, when will that backflow happen? Whether that happens during the ventricle contraction or whether that happens when the ventricle relaxes. Okay? So last structure that we have to talk about is the heart tendon. Now you'll see when you dissect the heart tomorrow that there are very tough strings-like structures that is pulling the cuspid valves. Now this doesn't happen to semilunar valve and every other valves in the veins. So why is it necessary to have a string to pull these valves? Now one common mistake among my students when they learn this very early is that they think that this tendon acts like a mechanism that actively open or close the valve. So they imagine that, alright, this string will pull and open the valve, and then this string would push and then close the valve. This is wrong. Again, the opening and the closing of the valve is all done by natural pressure. So when the pressure pressed this way, the valve would naturally close because of its shape. So why is there a tendon then? This is unique to heart valves here and not any other valves in the blood vessels because of the pressure they have to face. Now think again about semilunar valve. They face the pressure in which the blood is falling down, but these pressure are quite low in some way because the blood is only naturally falling back. So the valve is okay, they will close properly. But imagine this pair of valves that I draw here. Let's imagine this is a cuspid valve located between the atrium and the ventricle. It closes when the ventricle contracts and relaxes. 自己諗下 When the ventricle contracts so that the blood pushes this way and close the valve. So normally the valve should be closed like this. However, don't forget ventricle is very muscular, very powerful. So it is an actively created pressure that push on these valves. Such a great pressure may push the valve too much. So what will happen next? Can you imagine if the valve is being pushed too strong? So the valve would continue to go up, continue to go up, and normally it should close, right? They press on each other. But since the pressure is too great, there is a possible chance that the valve is turned this way. Because the ventricle pressure is really, really great. And if this happens, you can see that there is a new opening created, and it causes the blood to be able to backflow. This situation, we said that the valve is being turned inside out. The inside of the valve becomes the outside. Let's check. Right? The inside. This should be the inside of the valve. Now it flaps like this, so it becomes the outside there. So we say the valve is turned inside out. Again, this won't happen in other valves. This will only happen in the cuspid valve because they have to face such a great pressure from the ventricle. So how can we solve this problem? By having a string, a very tough string, that pulls the end of the valve to the wall of the ventricle. So imagine the string will hold the valve so that even if there is a very great pressure acting on the valve, it can hold the valve in the correct shape so that it won't turn inside out. So this is the function of a heart tendon, is to prevent the valve from turning inside out. Apply that idea into this picture. So when the ventricle contracts, the pressure is pressing on the valve. The valve will close initially, but the very great pressure may have the danger of flipping it up, flipping it out, flipping it inside out. Alright, the string, the heart tendon here, holds the valve so that it can't flip inside out. So that's the end of our discussion about heart structure. Instead of watching this video several times, I would rather you read the direction of the blood flow several times so that you can memorize how the blood flow, starting from vena cava, collecting the blood from all different body parts, and eventually reaching aorta so that the oxygenated blood can flow to the organs again. So good luck for the dictation tomorrow.